She was beaten for stealing bread until the banker called her sister. The town of Bitter Creek sat low and tired beneath the Colorado sun, its wooden buildings bleached gray by years of wind and heat. Dust moved through the streets like something alive, rising with each footfall, settling on windowsills and wagon wheels and the shoulders of men who had long since stopped caring what they looked like. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, where names didn't matter as much as silence, and survival mattered more than either. She had no name here, not one that anyone bothered to ask. The girl moved along the edge of the boardwalk, her dress torn at the hem, her hair pulled back in a loose braid that had come undone days ago. Her cheeks were hollow, the kind of hollow that spoke of weeks without proper food, and her hands, small, dirt-stained, trembling slightly, hung at her sides like things she no longer trusted. She had learned to walk without sound, to breathe without drawing attention, to make herself so small that the world might forget she existed. But hunger had a way of making people bold. The general store stood at the corner of Main Street, its door propped open to let in what little breeze the afternoon could offer. Inside, the shopkeeper, a thick man named Garner with a face like old leather, stood behind the counter, counting coins into his palm. A woman in a faded bonnet browsed the shelves. A rancher leaned against the doorframe, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. No one looked at the girl as she stepped inside. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the shelves. Flour, sugar, canned beans. And there on the counter near the window, a loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in brown paper. Her stomach twisted. She had not eaten in 2 days. The shopkeeper turned his back, muttering something to the rancher about cattle prices and the dry season. The woman in the bonnet moved toward the back of the store. The girl's hand moved before her mind could stop it. Her fingers closed around the bread, and she slipped it beneath her shawl, pressing it against her ribs like a secret she could not afford to lose. She turned toward the door. Stop. The word cut through the air like a gunshot. The girl froze. Her heart slammed against her chest, hard and fast, and for a moment she thought about running. But Garner was already moving, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his hand reaching out to grab her wrist. "Thief," he said, loud enough for the street to hear. The bread fell from her hands and hit the floor. She did not look at it. She looked at Garner's face, red, angry, righteous, and she knew what was coming. He dragged her into the street. The crowd gathered quickly, the way crowds always did when there was something to see. Men stepped out of the saloon. Women peered from doorways. A few children ran closer, their eyes wide with curiosity and cruelty. The girl did not struggle. She had learned long ago that struggling only made it worse. Garner shoved her to her knees in the dust. "This girl," he shouted, his voice carrying across the square, "stole from my store. Stole bread. Stole what don't belong to her." Someone in the crowd laughed. Someone else spat into the dirt. "She ought to be whipped," a voice called out. Garner nodded, his jaw tight. He pulled the belt from his waist, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The girl closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had no tears left. The first strike came down across her back, and the pain was sharp and hot and familiar. She had been beaten before, by men who wanted to teach her a lesson, by women who wanted to remind her of her place, by a world that had no use for girls like her. She bit down on her lip and tasted blood. The second strike came. Then the third. The crowd watched in silence. Some looked away. Some did not. And then, across the square, a man stopped walking. He was tall, dressed in a fine coat that marked him as someone of means, someone who did not belong to the dust and desperation of Bitter Creek. His boots were polished. His hat was clean. He carried himself like a man who had built something and wanted the world to know it. A banker, maybe, or a merchant. Someone who had money and manners and a life that made sense. But when he looked at the girl kneeling in the street, something in him broke. He saw her face, thin, pale, streaked with dirt. And he saw another face. A face from 15 years ago. A face from a farm in Missouri, before the war, before the fire, before the world fell apart. He saw green eyes that looked too much like the eyes he used to know. He saw the shape of a mouth the angle of a jaw, the way her shoulders hunched forward as if she were trying to disappear. His breath caught in his chest. "Stop," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Garner paused, the belt still raised. The crowd turned. The man in the fine coat stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the girl. "How much?" he asked. Garner frowned. "What?" "How much for the bread?" Garner looked at him like he had lost his mind. "She stole it." "I know what she did," the man said quietly. "How much?" Garner hesitated, then named a price, more than the bread was worth, but not so much that it would be refused. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a wallet. He counted out the bills slowly, deliberately, and handed them to Garner without a word. The shopkeeper stared at the money, then at the man, then at the girl. He shoved the belt back through his loops and muttered something under his breath. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the show was over. The man in the fine coat knelt beside the girl. She did not look at him. She stared at the ground, her hands pressed into the dirt, her breathing shallow. "Can you stand?" he asked. She did not answer. He reached out gently and touched her shoulder. She flinched, but she did not pull away. Slowly, carefully, he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, her legs weak, and he steadied her with a hand on her arm. "Come with me," he said. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and something passed between them. A flicker of recognition, a question without words. He did not tell her why his hands were shaking. He did not tell her why his voice had gone soft. He only led her down the street, away from the crowd, away from the dust and the shame, and she followed because she had nowhere else to go. And in the quiet of that walk, Samuel Garrett felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on him like a stone he could not lift. Samuel's home stood at the edge of town, a 2-story house with white paint that had not yet faded and windows that caught the light in the evening. It was the kind of house that spoke of success, of a man who had come west with nothing and turned dust into dollars. The banker, they called him. The man who held the mortgages, who decided which rancher kept his land and which cowboy got a loan to start fresh. He was respected, feared maybe, but never questioned. He had built that life carefully, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And he had built it alone. The girl walked beside him in silence, her bare feet moving softly over the dirt road. She did not ask where they were going. She did not thank him for stopping the beating. She only followed, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the ground. Samuel did not speak either. He did not know what to say. When they reached the house, he opened the door and stepped aside. She hesitated at the threshold, her body tensed like an animal that had learned to expect traps. He waited. After a long moment, she stepped inside. The interior was clean and ordered, wooden floors polished smooth, furniture arranged with precision, a clock ticking steadily on the mantel. It smelled of soap and old paper and the faint trace of cigar smoke. The girl stood just inside the door, her hands hanging at her sides, her eyes moving over the room like she was trying to understand what kind of place this was. "Sit," Samuel said quietly, gesturing toward a chair near the window. She did not sit. She stood there, staring at him with eyes that were too old for her face. Green eyes. The same green he remembered from a lifetime ago. He turned away, his chest tight, and walked into the kitchen. His hands shook as he filled the kettle and set it on the stove. He had not felt this unsteady in years, not since the war, not since the night he rode away from Missouri with the farm burning behind him and his mother's screams still ringing in his ears. He had thought his sister was dead. He had been certain of it. But when he looked at this girl, this stranger who had stolen bread because she was starving, he saw Eliza's face. He saw the way she used to tilt her head when she was listening, the way her mouth would press into a thin line when she was afraid but did not want to show it, the way she moved, careful and quiet, like the world was something that might break her if she touched it too hard. It could not be her. It was impossible. And yet, he brought the tea into the front room and set the cup on the small table beside the chair. The girl had not moved. She stood in the same spot, her arms still wrapped around herself, her eyes still watching him. "Drink," he said. She looked at the cup, then at him. She did not move. Samuel sat down in the chair across from her, his hands resting on his knees. He studied her face, the hollow cheeks, the bruise forming along her jaw, the way her hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. She could not have been more than 20, maybe younger. It was hard to tell. Hunger aged people in ways that time alone could not. "What's your name?" he asked. She did not answer. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, though he knew the words meant nothing. Everyone was afraid of something. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to him. She was measuring the distance, calculating her chances. "You can leave if you want," Samuel said, "but you don't have to." For a long time, she said nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she spoke. "Why?" The word hung in the air between them, fragile and sharp. Samuel did not have an answer. Or maybe he had too many answers, and none of them made sense. "Because you look like someone I loved. Because I owe a debt I can never repay. Because I am tired of being alone. Because no one should be beaten for being hungry," he said finally. Her mouth twitched, something between a smile and a grimace. "Plenty of people get beaten for less." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or proof that he was lying. Then she moved, slowly, and lowered herself into the chair. She picked up the cup of tea and held it between her hands, but she did not drink. She only stared into it, watching the steam rise. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wanted to ask her where she had come from, how long she had been in Bitter Creek, if she had any family, any place to go. But he could not make the words come, because if he asked, she might answer. And if she answered, he might learn something he was not ready to know. So instead he sat in silence, and she sat in silence, and the clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds like something counting down to an ending neither of them could see. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The light came through the window and fell across the girl's face, softening the hard lines, making her look younger. Samuel's throat tightened. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "You can stay there tonight. There's a bed, clean sheets." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And tomorrow? We'll see." She nodded slowly, like she did not believe him but was too tired to argue. She set the cup down on the table, still full, and stood. Samuel rose with her. "Upstairs," he said, pointing toward the stairs. "First door on the left." She walked past him without a word, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He watched her climb the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister, her shoulders hunched forward like she was carrying something too heavy to hold. When she disappeared into the hallway above, Samuel sank back into his chair. He pressed his hands to his face and let out a long, shaking breath. He had spent 15 years building a life that made sense. A life with rules and order and no room for the past. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, he felt the walls he had built begin to crack. And he did not know if he had the strength to hold them together. Morning came slowly to Bitter Creek, the sun rising pale and tired over the flat horizon. Samuel had not slept. He had sat in his chair downstairs, listening to the house settle around him, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the stairs or the creak of a door opening. But the girl, whoever she was, remained silent in the room above. When the light grew strong enough, he rose and walked into the kitchen. His movements were automatic, practiced. He built a fire in the stove, filled the kettle, sliced bread, and set it on a plate with butter and jam. He cooked eggs in a pan, scrambled with a little milk, the way his mother used to make them. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, and for a moment he was 12 years old again, standing at the table in Missouri while his mother hummed to him and his sister poured coffee into chip cups. He pushed the memory away. Upstairs, he heard a door open. Then footsteps, soft and hesitant, moving across the hallway. He waited, his hands resting on the counter, his heart beating harder than it should. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs, still wearing the same torn dress, her hair still tangled, but her face was cleaner now. She must have used the wash basin in the room. She looked younger in the morning light. Fragile. Like something that had been broken and badly mended. "There's food," Samuel said, nodding toward the table. She did not move. "You should eat," he added, his voice gentler. She walked slowly into the kitchen, her bare feet soundless on the floor. She sat at the table and stared at the plate in front of her. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then she picked up the fork and began to eat, slowly at first, then faster, like she could not stop herself. Samuel turned away. He did not want her to see him watching. When she finished, she set the fork down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. The silence between them was heavy, full of questions neither of them knew how to ask. "There's a bath upstairs," he said. "Second door on the right. I'll leave some clean clothes outside the door. They won't fit perfectly, but they're better than what you're wearing." She looked at him, her green eyes wary. "Why are you doing this?" "I told you. No one should be beaten for being hungry." "But you don't know me." "No," Samuel said. "I don't." It was not a lie. Not exactly. He did not know her. He only knew what he suspected. And he was not ready to say it out loud. She stood, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'll be gone by tonight." "You don't have to be." "I don't stay anywhere long." Samuel nodded slowly. He understood that. He had been the same way once, always moving, always running, afraid that if he stayed in one place too long the past would catch up with him. She left the kitchen without another word, and he heard her footsteps on the stairs again. He sat alone at the table, staring into his coffee, wondering if he was making a mistake, wondering if he should just let her go. But he could not. An hour later, he stood outside the guest room door, a bundle of clothes in his hands, a simple dress that had belonged to no one, bought from the general store years ago for a reason he could not remember, and a shawl that was too fine for someone like her, but was all he had. He knocked softly. "I'm leaving these here," he called. There was no answer. He set the clothes on the floor and walked back downstairs. When she came down again, she was wearing the dress. It was too big, hanging loose on her thin frame, but it was clean. Her hair was still damp, combed back and tied with a strip of cloth. She looked different. Not better, exactly. Just different. "Thank you," she said again, the word stiff and uncertain. Samuel gestured toward the front room. "You can rest in there if you want. There's a chair by the window." She followed him into the parlor, her step slow and cautious, like she was walking into a place she did not belong. He watched as she moved through the room, her eyes taking in the furniture, the clock, the books on the shelf. She did not touch anything. She only looked. And then she stopped. Her gaze had fallen on the guest room door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the opening, she could see the bed, neatly made, a pillow at the head, and at the foot, folded carefully, a quilt. It was faded now, the blue and white pattern worn soft by time, but the stitches were still tight, still perfect. A double wedding ring design, sewn by hand, each piece of fabric chosen with care. It had been made in a different life, in a farmhouse in Missouri, by a woman who had believed that love and thread could hold a family together. The girl moved toward the door. Samuel's breath caught. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. She walked to the bed and stood there, staring at the quilt. Her hand reached out, trembling, and her fingers touched the fabric. She traced the pattern slowly, following the circles, the way the colors fit together, the tiny stitches that held it all in place. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Samuel stood in the doorway, his throat tight. He could not speak. She turned to look at him, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Where did you get this?" "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough. Her hand pressed against the quilt, her fingers curling into the fabric. "No," she said. "It was our mother's." The words hung in the air like something fragile and terrible. Samuel felt the floor tilt beneath him. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. "What did you say?" She looked at him, and her eyes were full of tears and fury and something else, something that looked like hope and grief tangled together. "I said it was our mother's. She made it the year before the war." She made it for us. Samuel's vision blurred. He took a step forward, his voice breaking. Eliza. She did not move. She only stared at him, her chest rising and falling, her hands still clutching the quilt. Eliza, he said again, and this time it was not a question. Her face crumpled. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking, and she pressed the quilt to her face like it was the only thing in the world that could hold her together. Samuel crossed the room and knelt in front of her. His hands hovered near her shoulders, but he did not touch her. He did not know if he had the right. I thought you were dead, he said, his voice breaking. I thought, when the house burned, I thought you were inside. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears. I wasn't, she said, but I might as well have been. He shook his head, his own tears falling now, hot and fast. I'm sorry. Eliza, I'm so sorry. I should have. You left, she said, her voice sharp. You left me. I thought you were gone, he said. I thought there was nothing left to stay for. There was me, she whispered. The words hit him like a fist to the chest. He bowed his head, his hands shaking. I know, he said. I know. For a long time, they sat in silence, the quilt between them, the weight of 15 years pressing down on both of them like something too heavy to carry alone. Outside, the wind moved through the streets of Bitter Creek, stirring the dust, carrying the scent of sage and distance. Inside, two people who had once been family, who had once been everything to each other, tried to find their way back through the years and the silence and the mistakes that had torn them apart. And neither of them knew if it was possible. The sun went down over Bitter Creek, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Samuel lit the lamp in the parlor, and the warm light filled the room, pushing back the shadows. Eliza sat in the chair by the window, the quilt draped across her lap, her fingers still moving over the fabric like she was reading a story written in thread. Samuel sat across from her, his hands folded, his eyes on her face. He did not know where to begin. There was too much to say, and all of it felt impossible. Tell me, he said finally. Tell me what happened after the farm burned. Eliza did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the quilt, her voice low and steady, like she was reciting something she had memorized long ago. I was in the barn when it started. I heard Mama screaming, but by the time I ran to the house, the flames were too high. I couldn't get inside. Samuel closed his eyes. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, imagined her running toward the fire, calling for them, her small hands beating against the heat. He had told himself she was inside. He had told himself there was nothing he could have done. I waited until morning, Eliza continued. The house was just ash. I looked for you, but you were gone. Your horse was gone. I thought maybe you had ridden for help, but you never came back. I thought you were dead, Samuel said, his voice breaking. I rode as fast as I could to get help, but when I came back the next day, there was nothing left. I looked for you. I looked everywhere. Not everywhere, she said quietly. The words cut deep. Samuel opened his mouth to argue, to explain, but he could not. Because she was right. He had looked, but not long enough. He had grieved, but then he had run. He had told himself there was nothing left to stay for, and he had ridden west, leaving Missouri and the farm and the memory of his family behind. What happened to you? He asked. Eliza let out a slow breath. A neighbor found me the next day, took me to the town orphanage. I stayed there for 2 years. Then they put me on a wagon heading west, said there were families out here looking for workers, girls who could cook and clean and earn their keep. She paused, her jaw tightening. Telit. Samuel felt his chest tighten. He did not ask her to say more. He could see it in her eyes. The years of hurt, the men who had taken advantage, the towns that had turned her away when she had nowhere else to go. She had survived, but survival had cost her everything. I worked where I could, she said. Kitchens, mostly. Saloons. Ranches when they needed extra hands during harvest. But I was always moving, always running. Because if you stay too long, people start to notice. They start to ask questions. And if you're a woman with no family, no husband, no one to vouch for you, she stopped, her voice catching. They decide you're worth less than nothing. Samuel leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. "You should have looked for me." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I didn't know you were alive. And even if I did, what would I have said? Hello, brother, remember me? The sister you left behind." "I didn't leave you," Samuel said, his voice rising. "I thought you thought I was dead," Eliza interrupted. "I know. You said that. But you didn't check. You didn't stay long enough to be sure. You ran, Samuel. You ran because it was easier than staying." The accusation hung between them, heavy and true. Samuel wanted to deny it, to defend himself, but he could not. Because she was right. He had run. He had told himself it was survival, but it had been cowardice. He had been 18 years old and terrified, and instead of searching for his sister, instead of rebuilding, he had fled west and built a new life, a life where he did not have to remember. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Eliza, I'm sorry." She looked at him then, her green eyes filled with something he could not name. Anger, maybe, or grief, or something deeper than both. "I don't know if sorry is enough." "I know," Samuel said. "But it's all I have." They sat in silence for a long time, the lamplight flickering between them. Outside, the town was settling into sleep, doors closing, voices fading, the sound of horses being led into stables. Inside, two people who had once shared everything tried to find a way to share the same space again. Finally, Eliza spoke. "Tell me about you. Tell me how a farm boy from Missouri became a banker in Colorado." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. "I worked. I saved. I took risks that most men wouldn't take, and I got lucky more often than I deserved. I loaned money to ranchers and cowboys and outlaws who needed a fresh start, and most of them paid me back. The ones who didn't," he shrugged. "I learned to be careful." "You learned to be alone," Eliza said. Samuel looked at her, and he could not argue. "Yes. Why didn't you marry? Why didn't you build a family?" "Because I didn't deserve one," Samuel said simply. "I had a family once, and I lost them. I didn't think I had the right to try again." Eliza's expression softened. "That's a lonely way to live." "It is," Samuel admitted. But it felt safer than the alternative. She nodded slowly, like she understood. "I tried to marry once. A cowboy in Wyoming. He seemed kind. He said he didn't care about my past. But when his friends found out I'd worked in a saloon, they told him I wasn't fit to be a wife." She smiled bitterly. He believed them. Samuel felt anger rise in his chest, hot and sharp. He was a fool. "Maybe," Eliza said. "Or maybe he was just like everyone else." They talked through the night, their words filling the spaces that 15 years of silence had carved out. They talked about the farm, about their mother's hymns and their father's laugh. They talked about the war, about the soldiers who had burned their home, about the way the world had changed and left them behind. They talked about guilt and regret and the weight of choices that could never be undone. And slowly, carefully, they began to stitch their lives back together, not the way they had been, but the way they could be now. When morning came, Samuel stood at the window and watched the sun rise over Bitter Creek. Eliza slept in the chair, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. He did not wake her. He only stood there, thinking about what came next. He had spent 15 years building a life that looked successful from the outside. But inside it had been empty. A house with no laughter. A table with no one to share a meal. A bed that was too big and too cold. But now, for the first time in years, he had a reason to stay. When Eliza woke, he made breakfast, eggs and coffee, and the last of the bread. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who were learning to trust again. After breakfast, Samuel stood and held out his hand. "Come with me." Eliza looked at him, her eyes wary. "Where?" "Into town." She shook her head. "They'll recognize me. They'll remember what I did." "I know," Samuel said. "But they need to know who you are." "A thief." "My sister." Eliza stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she took his hand. They walked through the streets of Bitter Creek together, side by side. The morning was cool, the air still, and the town was just beginning to wake. Shopkeepers swept their porches. A rancher led his horse toward the livery. A widow hung laundry on a line behind her house. And people stared. Samuel felt their eyes on him, on them. He heard the whispers, saw the way heads turned and voices dropped. Garner stood in the doorway of the general store, his arms crossed, his face hard. The sheriff leaned against the post outside his office, watching him pass. A group of cowboys stopped talking and turned to look. Samuel did not let go of Eliza's hand. He walked with his head high, his grip firm, and he did not look away. When they reached the center of town, he stopped. He turned to Eliza, and he spoke loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "This is my sister," he said. "Her name is Eliza Garrett. She's been lost for 15 years, and now she's home." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the faces around them, some curious, some judgmental, some indifferent. But Samuel did not let go. He stood beside her, and he did not flinch. Garner spat into the dirt and turned away. The sheriff nodded slowly, then walked back into his office. The cowboys muttered something and moved on. But Eliza felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, she did not need that. Not acceptance, she had stopped hoping for that long ago. But something else. Something quieter and stronger. She felt seen. For the first time in years, she was not a thief or a vagrant or a woman with no name. She was someone's sister. She was someone who mattered. And as they walked back toward the house, Samuel's hand still holding hers, Eliza realized that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found her way home.